was on there one time, but now it's not there.
That's what Brendan was just saying with him too, so I don't know what's going on. I'll look in a minute and see if everybody's, did you receive an invite?
I did when we did the evaluation thing, it was
Yeah.
there, and then, next time I looked, I can't tell you how much longer after that, it
Yeah.
was not.
That's probably. It's showing both you and them is still pending. So I'm gonna resend them right now. And they've been sent successfully, so if you don't receive them, then let me know and we'll try to get that sorted out.
You would go to the Wiley email where the invite would come in, right?
Dixie did it. I don't know what email it was, I just see.
When I open up Canvas, it's still showing performance, leadership, and supervision. If I hit it, Larry at Wallbeds by Wiley.
Wallbeds is misspelled. It's missing an L. Right?
Yeah, Wall.
Yep.
WA.
So you'll never get that email. So let's add one. Is it just Larry?
Yeah, just Larry at Wallbeds by Wiley.
Dot com?
Yep.
Okay. Next. So that should have sent that to you.
Yeah, we're doing that. There we go.
There's another. If you don't get it, let me know. That was a for sure.
Is that who you had?
It's time, and we're recording, so, good afternoon, everybody. My voice is in worse shape than it was 2 days ago. I thought it'd be better by now, and yesterday I lost my voice almost totally. This morning I was on a project, and there was a doctor on the project, so I saw a doctor, and he basically said, stop talking. And so I said, I can't stop talking. I teach for a living. And he said, well, you better take a day off and stop talking. You're not contagious. He didn't think, but I've done damage to my throat. So he said, stop talking. So I'm going to talk as little tonight as I can. We're gonna video some things, and we're gonna learn. We're not gonna table the project of what you're doing on your network diagramming. We're gonna enhance it a little bit. We're gonna add to it, learn a little bit more about it. There are two primary methods of network diagramming for project management, and we have talked about critical path method quite a bit, and you've been looking at critical path. We need to know what the critical path is on a project if we're going to manage the project, because that's where we get late. That's where we have problems, is missing deadlines based on critical path. PERT is looking at a different method of looking at the overall project, and we're going to map some PERT diagrams out as well today. Got a handout. I'm going to give you a walk through it in a while, but first I want to watch two videos. They're fairly good-sized video, 20-minute type videos. We are going to look at two ways in time. We're going to look at two ways of network diagramming that are labeled as an AON and an AOA. And what that means is the A stands for activity, and so we have the activity is drawn on the node. And on the AOA, the activity is drawn on the arrow. Now, so far we've been doing AON, activity on the node, and we've drawn the little boxes that are looking at the dedicated number, projected number of hours, or days, or years for that particular project piece, that part, and we letter the part. Part B, task B, whatever it might be. And then we have an early start, late start, excuse me, early finish, late finish. And that's what our homework assignment is about. And we're gonna meet in our teams to plan a Christmas party. And we hope we'll get a chance to do that today as well. But before we do that, I want us to learn a little bit more about CPM and PERT. Watch some videos. We'll talk a little bit about it. The first video that we watch, I'd like you to kind of summarize it when we're done with it. And specifically, I'd like to call on Josie and Andrew and Larry after this video to kind of give us your 2 cents worth of a couple of walkaway points. Don't reteach it by any means, but just what was something that popped out based on what we've talked about so far that maybe became clearer. And we'll watch another one, and 3 others of you will report on that video to the rest of us a little bit. We'll start there, and then we will dive deeper after that, because what we need to learn is it's one thing to learn how to draw the thing out, but what do we got once we draw it out? You got a picture. And that's helpful getting everybody on the team back into place. But the purpose of that picture is that's a map of saying this is how we planned it. But does it ever go as planned? Projects don't ever go as planned. There's always a curveball. Always something happens. And so this plan gives us the map to know what do we do. You know, it's, you know, your phone is rerouting all the time. Why? Because you made a different turn, or the road was closed, or it was blocked, whatever. And as you changed your route on the way from here to Vegas, it rerouted you, it rescheduled it, it made a change in the plan, and that may have changed your arrive time, and it may change your cost because you may have to drive extra miles. If you're a semi-truck driver, you're paid by the mile, and you're paid by the book mile, not the actual numbers you drive. So it's the computer says how many miles it is from where you pick up the load to where you deliver. And that's how many miles you get paid for. You get paid by the mile, $2 a mile, whatever the number is. That's what you get paid. If you take a 40-mile detour, that's out of your pocket. And so you rerouted, but maybe you did that so you could get there on time. Because maybe a ridge is out somewhere, or ice closed this interstate. Whatever it is, you chose to reroute. Well, that's what this plan that we're doing right now we put that in place so that now we have intelligence that we can reroute. How do we reroute? How do we change the plan if we get a curved ball, or when we get a curved ball? And one of the terms that we're going to use is called crashing the model. So we're going to crash the PERT diagram or the CPM diagram. We're going to crash it, say, okay, we got a problem here. What can we change downstream that will still get us in on time, on budget? And that's crashing the plan. The plan's not going to go as it did, as you planned it to go. It's going to be changed. And so we want to do that with as much control as we can. So that's where we're going to dive into after we kind of master the diagramming part itself. Why we're diagramming isn't so we can just have a pretty picture of what we've done. It's so we have a management tool of how we can show others what we need to change when we get that curveball, when we get that road closed or whatever it might be. So look further down the horizon. That's what we're trying to learn here. That's what we're trying to do. So we're going to look at network diagrams, and then we're going to look at CPM and PERT together, the first two videos that we watched.
This tutorial is to deal with the question of making a network diagram from a work breakdown schedule in the context of project management. So to describe first of all what a work breakdown schedule is, a work breakdown schedule is usually a table that lists all the different tasks that have to be completed for an overall project to be complete. It lists what the estimated duration is of all those tasks, and it lists what the dependencies are of those tasks. So let's look at this one here in front of us. I've got a number of different activities, all labelled between A and H. I've got all of the different estimates of how long each of those different activities will take to complete. And I've got all of the different dependencies of those tasks. Now, what these dependencies mean is that if I list, for instance, in the case of task C here, any immediate predecessors, that means that I have to have these tasks A and B complete before I can start task C. Anywhere where I don't have any immediate predecessors, that means that that task can start as soon as the project has started. So I can see for task A, task B, and task D, I don't need to have any other tasks complete. As soon as I start the project, I can start those tasks. What this question 7a is asking is to prepare a project network diagram, to calculate the scheduling times and total slack for each activity, and to list the critical path activities and the project duration. So let's have a look at that. I'm going to switch over to a kind of a nice tool that will allow me to draw out my project diagram easily. And just for ease of use, I've taken a screen print of my work breakdown schedule and I've copied it in here at the top of this diagram. So the first thing that we have to do in any network diagram in project management is we put in a start node. This just shows that the project has started, and then after that we can start to put in any of these different tasks that I can start straight away as soon as the project has started. And by that I mean, in this particular work breakdown schedule, I mean task A because it doesn't have any predecessor, task B because it doesn't have any predecessor, and task D because it doesn't have any predecessor. So each of those different tasks can start immediately and can start simultaneously with one another. So I'm going to draw on the different tasks on this network diagram for A, B, and D. Now, at the end of this project diagram, I'm going to have all of the different tasks with the predecessors or interdependencies shown with arrows. For the moment, just for the first draft of when I'm laying out my project network diagram, so that it's nice and tidy, just for the moment I'm not going to draw in any different arrows. I'm just going to do a brief kind of layout first of all, and then I'll draw in the arrows once I'm happy with the layout and that I'm happy that it will look tidy. Looking at the next task that I want to put in here, the one that I skipped over there that does have dependencies is task C, and I can see that C is dependent on A and B to be finished before it can start. So I'm going to put the task C somewhere over here so that I can draw arrows easily from A and B into C to show the dependencies. The next task that I'll be interested in is task E. So E is dependent on the task C. So again, I'm going to put E past C somewhere over here. and I'll just move that into position. Next task I'm interested in is task F. Task F is dependent on task D. So again, I'm going to insert the task F and move it down beside task D. Next task that I'm interested in is task G, and it is dependent on E and F. So I'm going to insert task G and move it over slightly over here so I can easily draw arrows between E and F to G. And then lastly, I've got task H. Task H, insert, and I'll put that past task G so I can easily draw an arrow in here. And my network diagram is taking shape. Now I need to put in all the different arrows to show all these different dependencies. And really, I could have done that while I was doing all of those different tasks and done them both together, but I often do it this way so that I can make sure that I try and avoid any arrows crossing over one another. So let me change to my arrow tool, and I will start drawing arrows between start and A, start and B, start and D. And then I need an arrow between A and B leading into C. And going down to E is dependent on C, so I need an arrow from C to E. And F is dependent on D. D has to finish before F can start, so I'll put an arrow between them. G is dependent on E and F, so I need to finish E and F before G can start. And then H is dependent on G, so I'll put an arrow between those two there. And let me just select all my arrows. I'll make them a slight bit bigger. Great. So that's a nice tidy network diagram. It clearly shows all the tasks, and it clearly shows all the interdependencies as well. It shows a definite flow from the start of the project, which tasks come first, and then as it moves through all the different interdependencies, it moves to a final point, which is in task H. At this stage, I want to start looking at the different scheduling times and total slack of each activity, and it involves a particular method, numerical method, which is quite involved. Before I go on to that, just to make it easier for me to quickly access the different estimated durations of all the different tasks, I'm going to put in a little subscript at the bottom of each of these different tasks that shows the estimated duration of each of them. And looking at my work breakdown schedule table, A has an estimated duration of 4, B has an estimated duration of 3, D has an estimated duration of 1, C has an estimated duration of 5, E also has an estimated duration of 5, F has an estimated duration of 2, G has an estimated duration of 5, and H has an estimated duration of 6. Now we're ready to go ahead and attempt this numerical method of finding all the different scheduling times and total slack of each activity, which I'll explain later. At the moment, from my work breakdown schedule, all of this information here is now contained in my chart. So I don't need this table anymore. It will give me more room. I can move my diagram up a little bit. And we can go ahead now and deduce the different scheduling times of each of the different tasks. So to allow me to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on a crosshairs beside each of the different tasks. And as best as I can, I'm going to try and fit them in beside the different tasks. I usually go for the top right hand side of each of the tasks, and you usually try and keep it consistent. We might need a little bit more space there. I'll just move some of these paths down here, and I'll just give B a little bit more room so I can clearly see that crosshair here. So all of my different tasks, they've all got a crosshair just to the top right of them. Now what these crosshairs are for, well, I'm going to put in a different number in each of the different quadrants of these crosshairs, and then finally, once I've done that, I can calculate a different number for total slack, which I'll put at the top. To show what each of these different numbers mean, I'm going to put a legend over at here at the top right of my diagram. And the first text for the first quadrant What that is I'm going to put in there is ES, standing for early start, meaning what is the earliest possible start I can start an activity. The next number, which is in the top right quadrant, is EF, standing for early finish. What's the earliest possible time I can finish an activity? For the moment, I'm just going to leave it at those two, because I just need to calculate those two numbers for the first pass going from left to right across my network diagram. So let's apply that logic to some of these different tasks. If I look at task A, it can start immediately, as soon as the project can start. So the earliest possible time I can start task A is at day 0. So that's the number I'm going to put in here in this quadrant, the earliest possible start. Because A, the estimated duration is 4 days, if I can start the task at time 0, the earliest possible time I can finish that task is on day 4. So the number that I'm going to put in here for early finish is 4. Applying that logic that I'm just after doing there with task A to task B and task D, both of these tasks can also start as soon as the project starts. So each of them can start at day 0. So the early start of A from B and D is time 0. So I'll put 0 in each one of those quadrants. And then for task B, because it can start on day 0 and it takes 3 days, then the earliest possible time I can finish task B is on day 3. So I'll put 3 into that quadrant. And for task D, the earliest possible time I can start task D is day 0. So the earliest possible time I can finish task D, given that it's got an estimated duration of 1, is day 1. And 1 goes into that quadrant. Now, those earliest tasks, all of those tasks that can start simultaneously as soon as the project starts, they're quite easy to find out what the early start and the early finish are. Let's move on to some of the more kind of complicated tasks. For instance, task C. I want to fill in a number for this top left quadrant, the early start of task C. So again, I'm going to ask the question, what is the earliest possible time I can start task C? Now this is more tricky than what we've done with task A, B and D before, because C is dependent on both A and B to be finished before task C can start. I have to have A and B finished and completed before I can start task C. So if I look at the different finishing times of task A and task B finishes on day 3, and the earliest possible time that the task A can finish is day 4. So for me to be able to start task C, I have to wait for both B and A to be finished, and therefore I'm going to take that number from the early finish of A, and that is a number that I'm going to be putting in at this early start of C. The earliest possible time I can start C is when A is finished at day 4. So I take the 4 from that quadrant and I place the 4 here. Given that task C has an estimated duration of 5 days and the earliest possible time I can start task C is on day 4, then the earliest possible time I can finish task C is 4 plus 5, which is day 9. Let's look at task F. Task F is dependent on task D to be finished before it can start. So the earliest possible finish for task D is the day 1. So therefore the earliest possible time I can start task F is day 1. Given that F has a duration of 2, the earliest possible time I can finish task F is 1 plus 2 is 3. Let's look at task E. Task E is dependent on C to finish. Therefore, the earliest possible time I can start E is when C finishes on day 9. So that's the number that I'm going to put in on the early start quadrant of E. And given that E takes 5 days, the earliest possible time I can finish task E is 9 plus 5, which is day 14. Let's move down to task G. Now again, G is a little bit more complicated than E or F. because I've got two different dependencies there. G is dependent on E and F to be finished before it can start. So I have a choice here of whether I take the 14 or the 3. So it was similar to the choice that I made back with task C when I had to choose the early finish times of A or B as the early start time of C. And the logic again holds. I have to hold off and wait for both of these tasks to finish before I can start task G. So if F has an early finish of 3 and E has an early finish of 14, I have to wait for E at day 14. So on the way over in this forward pass, I always take the highest number of the early start quadrants of the preceding tasks. The early start of G is 14. The earliest possible finish time is 14 plus 5, which is 19. And then I've got task H is the only one left. And again, that's a lot more straightforward. I've just got one dependency there. So the earliest possible start time is day 19. And the earliest possible finish time is 19 plus 6, 25. Having done the first pass across my project network diagram, looking at all the early starts and early finishes of all the different tasks, I've come up with this early finish number, which is of task H. Now task H is the last task. All the other tasks are feeding into it. Therefore, whatever this earliest finish time or number is for task H, that is the overall duration of the entire project. This entire project, the way that it's scheduled at the moment, it takes 25 days to complete all the different tasks, to complete the entire project. And I'll just take note of that down here at the bottom right of my diagram. I've mentioned a few times that all of these numbers that we've done for the early start and early finish quadrants of my crosshairs on all the different tasks, that it's the first pass going from left to right across my diagram. Now we're at the stage where we can do the second pass, which is backwards, right to left across the diagram. And before I do that, I need to fill in what the different quadrants at the bottom of my crosshairs stand for. The bottom left-hand quadrant of the crosshairs, it stands for late start. What's the latest possible time I can start this task, but still keep the overall project on track to finish in 25 days? And the bottom right-hand quadrant of my crosshairs is late finish. Again, what's the latest possible time I can finish this task, but still keep the overall project duration on track? Now we'll understand this late start and late finish concept as we work backwards through the tasks. So first of all, let's go for the last task, which is task H. What's the latest possible time I can finish task H, but still keep the overall project duration at 25 days? Well, at this last task is very, very simple. I have to finish it by 25 days if I want to finish it by 25 days. So always, if I've got this kind of scenario where I've got converging tasks coming into one particular task at the end of the project, the numbers at the top of the crosshairs always are the same as the numbers at the bottom. So the latest possible time I can finish task H is at day 25 and still keep the overall project duration on track to finish in day 25. And because H takes 6 days, 25 minus 6 is equal to 19. That means that's the latest possible time that I can afford to let H start and still keep the overall project schedule on track. Let's look at task G. Again, I'm going to fill in the late finish quadrant first of all. What's the latest possible time I can finish task G and still keep the overall project duration on track to finish in 25 days? Well, I have to allow task H to start at day 19. So the latest possible time I could finish task G and still keep the whole project schedule on track is at day 19. I have to get finished by that time to allow H to finish. So I'm going to copy that text box from here. I'm going to take that 19 from there and put it there as the late finish in task G. Because G takes 5 days to complete, the latest possible time I can start task G and still keep the overall project schedule on track is at day 14. That's 19 minus 5. Let's look at the late finish for task E. What's the latest possible time I can finish task E and still keep the overall project duration on schedule? Again, I have to get E finished by day 14 to allow G to start by day 14 and keep all the tracks on schedule. So I am going to take the 14 from here and put it into this quadrant here. Task E takes 5 days, so 14 minus 5 is 9. 9 is the latest possible I can start task E and still keep the overall project duration on schedule. Let's look at task F. What's the latest possible time I can finish task F and still keep the overall project duration on schedule? Well, to allow G to start by day 14, I have to get task F finished by day 14. It doesn't matter so much that E and F could possibly finish on the same day, as long as they're both finished in time for G to start at day 14, that's fine. So I'm going to take the late start of G and I'm going to use it as the late finish of F. Because the duration of F is 2, 14 minus 2 is 12. When looking at task C, what's the latest possible time I can finish task C and still keep the overall project duration on schedule? Well, I have to get it finished by day 9 to allow E to start at day 9. So day 9 is the late finish of C. And 9 minus 5 is 4. Let's look at task D. D down here, to allow F to start at day 12, I am going to make sure that D is finished by day 12 as well. So you can see a pattern emerging here as well. I keep on looking at the following task from the task that I'm dealing with at the moment, and I pick out the late start of that task, 12 of F in this case, and I use that as the late finish of the task that I'm dealing with. So 12. Late start for D is 12 minus 1 is 11. Now, looking at task B. Task B has to get finished by day 4 to allow C to start at day 4. So I'm going to take the 4 from there and I'm going to bring it back here, 4 there. 4 minus 3 is 1. So the late start of B is 1. And then lastly, looking at task A, what's the latest possible time I can finish task A and still keep the overall project schedule on track? Well, the latest start of C is 4. So I'm going to take the 4 from there and I'm going to use it as the late finish of A. And 4 minus 4 is 0. And I'll move that into the late start position. And that finishes the second pass going from right to left across my network diagram. Now, the final piece of what happens to this legend over here is a number that I'm going to put right up at the top of each crosshair. In the legend, I'm going to put in the abbreviation TS, standing for total slack or total slippage. For the moment, I'm not going to explain what total slippage is. It will become clearer when we go on to the critical path method. But it's enough to say how to calculate the total slippage is I just take the late finish and subtract from it the early finish number of each of the different activities. So let me write that formula down. If I apply that formula to each of the different activities, these are the numbers that I get. For activity H, 25 minus 25 equals 0. For activity G, 19 minus 19 equals 0. For activity E, 14 minus 14 equals 0. For activity F, 14 minus 3 equals 11. For activity D, 12 minus 1 is equal to 11. For activity C, 9 minus 9 equals 0. For activity A, 4 minus 4 equals 0. And lastly, for activity B, 4 minus 3 equals 1. So those are all the total slacks or total slippages for the different activities in this project network diagram. At this stage, no matter what project network diagram that we're looking at, there will always be at least one path going from the start to the finishing task that has a trail of zeros on it. Now I say at least one because you can't have more than one path. But in this project network diagram, I just have the one. Going from the start, I see task A, task C, task E, task G, and task H. All have zeros for their total slippage. This path in any project network diagram is known as the critical path. And I'm just going to take a note of what the critical path is here. What the critical path means is that these tasks have to be finished on time as regards their estimated duration for the overall project to remain on schedule. If there is any slippage, or if there is any in the completion of these tasks, the overall project duration of 25 days will slip. Having zero slippage means that there is no leeway. On the other hand, these tasks that aren't on the critical path, B, D, and F, they have a certain amount of slippage. They have a certain amount of leeway. So for instance, with task F, I have 11 days slippage, which is quite generous, meaning that as a project manager, I don't have to be overly worried about the overall project schedule if task F starts to slip or starts to take a little bit longer than its expected 2 days. It's the same with task D and task B, although task B only has 1 day slippage. If task B goes from 3 days to 4 days, it's not anything to panic about. But if it goes any more than that, then all of a sudden it will have an effect on the overall project duration. So going through the steps that we have seen in this video tutorial, we have created a project network diagram. We've calculated the scheduling times and the total slack for each activity. We've calculated the overall project duration. And we've deduced it from all of that what the critical path of this particular project is. This is all really useful information for project managers. And this should be kept on hand for measuring the project's progress. The overall label that I'll put on this whole procedure is known as Work Breakdown Schedule to Project Network Diagram and the Critical Path Method.
Okay, we saw a couple things differently than we had seen in the previous video. And I've asked 3 of you to comment on whatever crossed your mind to comment on. Larry, start with you.
Now I understand it.
Yes.
So yeah, I didn't know they were getting the numbers for it there, but now that as he spelled it out like that, it was making sense. Then as he went backwards, I could see there were projects that cannot start late in order for
Right.
this thing to finish on time. Otherwise, it's out. Whereas the others, it was okay because their slack time is
Yeah.
greater.
So you just looked at a chart at first, and he started with nothing on the paper, right? So
Right.
you have to start at the start point, and you look at the task that has nothing that needs to precede it. It means you could start it anytime you want it. If I'm building a house, we'll go to that. You can't put the roof on the house until the frames are up, right? So that's you can't start with that project. That's got a preceding bunch of tasks that have to happen. But somewhere along the line, there's something that nothing has to happen before that. Maybe you're going to make the ground flat. You're going to just grade it flat, compact the ground at the build site. You could do that anytime, right? You need to do that at the beginning. You can't do it after the house is done, right? So that needs to be the start job or something close to that, right? Maybe there's something else. Maybe you're going to dig a hole, dig a drain, dig a sewer line. I don't know what that plan is going to call for, but there's a starting point from the task list. And sometimes there's more than one thing that can happen at that starting point, and sometimes there's not. Josie, what do you get?
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I had no idea how it worked until this video. He was pretty slow about it, but it helped a lot with laying out how to go from the chart into the diagram.
Yeah.
So I really like how you kind of like explain the entire thing. I thought that was pretty cool. But I think I get it.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to see another one, and we'll try that. And
For me, in doing the exercises, I struggled with, do I start with a 0 or do I start with a 1?
okay.
According to the handout that you gave us, the critical path handout, it says that he started with a 1, but you could start with a 0. And along the path, that math, when you start with a 1, gets a little tricky going forward and back. But when you just use a 0 on day 1, that makes it easy, especially to find an early start. And for me, that made it a lot easier. You're going to take, when you have an activity that has 2 predecessors, you're going to take the largest early end as your early start.
Right.
So whichever one of those numbers is greatest, that's going to go into your box.
Right.
You move on from there.
You picked up the 0-1 controversy, if you want to call it that. There's not a right or wrong. We've seen it now, video of it done both ways, and it's just get the math right. Get the math right. Figure it. Don't. Otherwise, what happens? You'll have an extra day, or you'll have a missing day. It's kind of like going back and forth on the ski. If you do it too many times, at some point in time, you lose an hour, right? and it'll screw you up. You'll be late for the wedding or whatever it is you're going to, the concert or whatever. And so you got to get the time change figured out. If you start with a 1, you got that same issue. It's easier to follow the math with the 0, but neither one is right or wrong. I'm glad you picked that up. Yep.
Why do they have them on then? So what is that supposed to say?
This goes into an argument back with control systems. Some of you are familiar with Allen Bradley equipment, Allen Bradley gears, Allen Bradley controls, and PLC programming. They always start at 0, and it screws everybody in the free world up because we start counting 1, 2, 3, and they count 0, 1, 2, 3, and so the network diagram goes back into control systems and the way they did it, and so it's kind of just an ancient way they do it. Siemens does not do that. Siemens starts at 1. And so that is Siemens controls are in the rest of the world besides Utah and the Midwest. I mean, American control systems are dominated by Allen Bradley, and European control systems are dominated by Siemens. And this diagramming goes back to those guys. They were diagramming what needs to turn on and off in what sequence when they're automating a mechanical control system. This goes back before the days of digital. Really goes into mechanical controls. And so that's not a good answer. That's just the history of it. It just one group came one way and one group did another one, and now we're stuck with both. Both are right. Just keep it straight whichever way you do it. Okay, we're going to watch one more, and this one we're going to look at CPM, which is what that is, and we're going to introduce PERT a little bit and talk about the two versus each other, and we'll see. Notice the diagram was different. This one has a box with 9 that we saw Tuesday. Today we just saw a box with the crosshair. It's just a note. It's a way of you keeping track in your brain. And I like a little extra space, so I put more in, but you do it however you want to do it. You don't have to use either one of those conventions. Just keep track of it as you go forward and backward. It's better if you put the data down, though, because then your partners can see it. The rest of the people on your team can see what's going on. One more, and this one, let's get some conversation from the back row. The 4 of you in the back row, look at this one and tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are as you view it.
Let's talk about the critical path method. The critical path method is one of 2 ways that you can, or one of 2 tools that you can use to identify the paths through your project. The other way is called PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. The difference between critical path and PERT is that critical path uses 1 time estimate, whereas PERT uses 3 time estimates. So critical path is more or less for when you're pretty sure about the durations, the time it's gonna take to do each task or each activity. Whereas PERT is used in a more uncertain situation. You remember our discussion about uncertainty? And you can use these 3 time estimates to come up with something called the expected time. We're going to start with the critical path method since it is the simplest way. We're going to use a method that's a little different than in your book. We're going to use this key. This key, if you'll notice in the center block, that is that A represents activity, and down here D represents duration, whereas ES is early start, EF is early finish, LS late start, and LF late finish. Over here we're going to have S, which is equal to slack time. You'll notice this block right here where I have the diagonal lines. All that is a block where you can write a description in of the activity if you choose to do so. So let's get into the details of critical path. When you're using the critical path method, you need 3 pieces of information: activity, predecessor, and duration. You need to have the activities listed. You need to know which activities are predecessors to other activities, and then you need to know the time that each duration will take. In this instance, we're going to use weeks as our unit of time. So using this information, we can draw a precedence diagram. And if you look at the precedence diagram, you can see all of the paths that go through our project. And there are many different paths. This means that some activities can be done concurrently, simultaneously. Some activities, though, cannot be done that way. They have to have the previous activity completed before you can move on. And so this drawing, this precedence diagram, gives you a pictorial view of what the project should look like. We can use this diagram to go through and identify our tasks, our paths. For instance, we have paths A, C, F, and I. We have path A, D, H, and J. Path A, D, G, and J, and path A, E, H, and J, B, F, and I. So we have 5 paths through this project. We can go through and we can use the information that we have for each one of these activities, and we can identify what the critical path is. So what is the critical path by definition? Well, if you'll remember in class, we talked about the critical path as being that path that if you had any delays on, it would delay the entire project. That means that there is 0 slack time associated with the critical path. By now, all the information we want to know is which one is the critical path. So we can go through and we can add up each one of the activity times, and we can see that for our first path it's 18 weeks, second 19, third 18, fourth 21, and fifth is 14. So what does that mean to us? Well, what that means is that our critical path is A, E, H, J, because it takes 21 weeks. That's the longest duration of any path in our project. And what that means is that these activities are not going to have any slack time on them. And that is the path that we're going to monitor through our project. So we're going to use this and use my boxes now. And I've drawn out the network, and this is what it would look like with the boxes. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do something called a backwards pass. We're going to do a forward pass. Okay? That means that we're going to move from left to right. In case y'all don't remember when you were in class, I told you I was dyslexic. Remember that. All right. So we're going to start with activity A. And if you remember, a starting activity begins at time 0. So our early start for activity A is going to be 0. The same thing for activity B, because if you remember on our information, activity B had no predecessors. Okay, so now we want to calculate what the early finish time is going to be. To calculate early finish, we're going to take early start and add the duration. So 0 plus 5, 0 plus 4. All right, so we've done the first two tasks. Now we're looking at this diagram and we see out of activity A that we have 3 arrows. We don't have to make any choice. We automatically know that the early start for each one of those activities is going to be 5. Again, we're going to calculate the early finish. 5 plus 3 is 8, 5 plus 4 is 9, 5 plus 6 is 11. Well, now we get into a little bit of a dilemma because we see all of these arrows going all different directions, so we sort it out. Okay, for activity F, right here, we have 2 activities that feed into it, C and B. We have to make a choice. You see that we have an early finish of 8 for activity C and an early finish of 4 for activity B. Remember by definition that the path, all of the activities have to be complete, all of the predecessor activities have to be complete before the new activity can begin. That means that we have to choose the highest of the 2. So we're going to choose 8 for our early start for activity F. For activity G, we only have one predecessor, which is D, so we don't have to make any choice. So for activity G, we're going to have 9 as our early start. For activity H, we have activity D and activity E that feed into H. So we have to look at those early finish times and we have to determine which one is going to be our early start for activity H. Activity D has a early finish of 9 and activity E has an early finish of 11. We're going to choose the higher of the 2, which is going to be 11. 11 plus 6 is 17, 9 plus 5 is 14, and 8 plus 4 is 12. So now we need to come over here to activity I. Activity I, we have no choice. We know our early start is 12. 12 plus 6 is 18. For activity J, we have to choose between the early finish for activity G and activity H. H has the larger number, so we're going to select the larger number for our early start for J. So 17 plus 4 is 21. If you'll remember, when we looked at our each path individually, the path that we selected had a duration of 21 weeks for the critical path. Well, that doesn't really give us a whole lot of information. We still don't have any more information than what we had when we just went through it and identified all the paths and added up the slack time. So what we want to do now is something called a backwards pass. When we're beginning our backwards pass, we're going to start with the late finish. Now, in order to calculate our late start, we're going to take our late finish and subtract our duration. But we have to get started on this. We have 2 ending activities. And I know when you were on class, you probably never saw this because all of the ones that we did had just one ending activity. When you have 2 ending activities, you have to select between the 2 times. So for activity J, which is an ending activity, it's 21 weeks. And for activity I, it is 18 weeks. Well, for both of these activities, we're going to use 21 to start our backwards pass. Because remember, 21 weeks equals the duration of the project. Everything has to be completed in 21 weeks. So now what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the late start for activity J. 21 minus 4 is 17. For I, 21 minus 6 is 15. So we're going to take 17 and we're going to transfer that into activity H and G as the late finish. And we're going to transfer 15 for activity F as the late finish. 17 minus 6 is 11. 17 minus 5 is 12. 15 minus 4 is 11. So now we've got to be a little bit careful because we're back in that situation where we have multiple arrows coming in and out of activities. So let's start with activity E. Activity E, we have one arrow. Okay, you see where it comes backwards here? So we're going to take 11 and transfer it down here. We don't have to make a decision. We know it's going to be 11. 11 minus 6 is 5. For activity D, well, now we've got to make a decision because we have two arrows coming backwards. Now remember, this is a backwards pass. That means that our rules have now reversed. So at this point, we're going to look at those late start times and we're going to choose the lowest of the two. So in this case, we're going to choose 11. 11 minus 4 is 7. So for activity C, we have one activity which is F. You see the arrow right here. So we're going to transfer 11 up here for the late finish. 11 minus 3 is 8. Okay, so for activity B, we don't have to make a decision because the only arrow that we have is the arrow leading to activity F. So we know that that is going to be 11. 11 minus 4 is 7. For activity A, however, we have to make a decision. We see that we have activities C, D, and E that come after activity A. So we need to choose the lowest of the late start times for our late start for activity A, and that happens to be 5. 5 minus 5 is 0. We still don't have a lot of information. We can look at this and we probably could off the top of our heads identify the critical path because we know by definition that it's going to be the activities that have 0 slack. But now that's what this little box is for right here, is to calculate slack. And to calculate slack, we can do it one of two ways. We can calculate slack looking at the late finish minus the early finish, or we can look at the late start minus the early start. Either formula you use, you should come up with the same answer. This is a really good checkpoint for you. Because you know that if you've got something off where you don't come up with the same slack time using either of these formulas, then you've done something wrong in your diagram. So let's go through and calculate slack time. For activity A, we're going to use late start minus early start. So 0 minus 0 is going to be 0. Now let's check out here. 5 minus 5 is 0 as well. So we know we're correct. For activity B, 7 minus 0 is going to be 7. And we can check here, 11 minus 4 is 7. We're going to go through and calculate the slack for each one of these activities. Now we can easily identify the critical path, and now we know which activities have slack time and which activities don't. If you'll think back, when we identified the critical path previously, we said that it was A, E, H, and J. If you look at A, E, H, and J, you see that each one of those activities have 0 slack time. Okay? The rest of them all have slack. What does slack mean? Well, that means that for activity B, we can actually wait 7 weeks before we start that activity. So we've got some leeway in there. What if we have valuable resources allocated to activity B? Well, now for 7 weeks, we can free up those resources. We can use them in other parts of this project, or we could use them on another project. So this gives us a way to analyze our project and start trying to figure out how we can allocate those resources. And it also helps us in the budgeting process that we've talked about previously. So that's the critical path method. As we started out talking, I told you there was a second method. It's called PERT, Program Evaluation and Review Technique. PERT uses 3 time estimates. It uses a time estimate that is called A, that is the optimistic time. The optimistic time, that's when, you know how in life we think of people as having these sunny dispositions, everything goes right, there's never a down day, and you know, we look at them like they're crazy. Well, that's what optimistic time is. You're thinking nothing in the world is going to go wrong, everything's going to go right, and this is the best time that we can complete that task in, okay? Not really the way to look at it, but we're going to soften that some with our formula in just a few moments. The letter B represents the pessimistic time. Pessimistic time, that's when everything is going to go wrong. Nothing in the world goes right. This task, this is the longest time that we can possibly think of that this task would take, given the fact that everything is going to go wrong. And then we have time M. You know, in life, we know that it's not always going to be the very best, and it's not always going to be the very worst. It's going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's what M represents. That's the most likely time. So we have those 3 time estimates that we have to deal with. And so when we look at how we're going to deal with those, we need to have some information, obviously. We have to know what the activities are and what the optimistic time is, the pessimistic time, and the most likely. Now you'll notice that this chart is laid out differently than I presented the time estimates, and that's because I've laid out the chart, and most books will lay out the chart the way that you're going to use the formula, okay? So we have all of our time estimates here. So let's just calculate a couple of them real quick, okay? We have our formula for expected time. You'll notice, and we have a column here, right here, for expected time. Well, our formula is A, optimistic time, plus 4 times the most likely time. Now, why would most likely time have a weight of 4? Well, that's because it is the most likely to occur. So we're going to weight that time more than the other 2 time estimates. You'll see that the pessimistic time only has a weight of 1, as does the optimistic time. So we're going to add all of those up, and then we're going to divide by 6. Why 6? Because we have 6 weights. Remember that we have an unseen 1 here and an unseen 1 here. So 1 plus 4 plus 1, 6. It's always going to be 6. It's constant. It will never change. So for our activity A, we can substitute in our time estimates. We have an optimistic time of 1 plus 4 times the most likely time, which was 2, plus the pessimistic time of 3. And we divide, that adds up to 12, and we divide that by 6, and we come up with 2. So now, for our chart, we can come back here, and we can simply fill in 2. Let's do one more. 2 is the optimistic time plus 4 times the most likely time of 3 for activity B, plus 4, which is the pessimistic time. That's going to add up to 18. We're going to divide that by 6, and so our expected time for activity B is 3. Everybody understand that? I'm sure you do. I know you don't want me to go through each and every one, so let's just fill in our chart. So now we have the expected time. We need some other information though. We want to know what the variance of each activity is going to be. We have a formula for the variance that we can use. The formula is the pessimistic time minus the optimistic time divided by 6, and then we're going to square that. So if we just do activities A and B, we can see that the pessimistic time of 3 minus the optimistic time of 1 divided by 6, so 2 divided by 6 squared is going to equal 0.11. For activity B, the pessimistic time of 4 minus 2, so 2 divided by 6, square it, and we're going to again have 0.11. So we're just going to fill in our chart. Okay, so now we've got the expected time, we've got the variances of the activities, and so now we're going to make some basic assumptions about our project. We're going to assume that our critical path for this project is A, C, E, G, and H. What we want to know is we want to know what the project variance is. Well, I know y'all didn't think you were going to have stats again. Well, this is terrible, but you're going to have them. But it's not as bad as it was when you were in statistics. What we're going to do is we're going to calculate our project variance. Project variance is denoted as the following. And all it is the sum of the variances along the critical path. So we can go back to our chart now and we can figure out what that is. It's 0.11 plus 0.11 plus 1 plus 1.78 plus 0.11. That's going to give us a total of 3.11. So we know that our project variance is 2.11, or I'm sorry, 3.11. We need another bit of information. We need to know what the standard deviation is. So in order to get the standard deviation, we're going to take the square root of the project variance. And that is going to be 1.76. Okay, so 1.76, Dr. Z, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that our project, the time, the duration of our project is going to be plus or minus 1.76 weeks. Now that's a piece of valuable information, isn't it? We can do a lot with that information. We know that we could be in trouble. It depends on what this project is. In this case, this project is a compliance project. It is a project where the company has to put in an air filtration system. Otherwise, the EPA is going to shut them down. They have to do it within 16 weeks. So now that plus or minus 1.76 weeks becomes a whole different picture, doesn't it? Because if they are over by 1.76 weeks, they're going to shut their company down. They are not going to be able to do business. They're going to lose money until the project is complete. And then you've got to get people out there to inspect it. So it could be far longer than 1.76 weeks that they're going to be shut down. So we want to avoid that. Well, the first question out of your boss's mouth is going to be, what is the likelihood that we're going to be finished by this time? And most of the time, we give them a SWAG answer. I'm hoping everybody knows what SWAG stands for. Okay? So I'm not sure I should say it and let it be recorded. So look it up on the internet. And we're going to figure out what the probability of this happening is. You know, we have assumed this, and we're going to assume one other bit of information, and that is that the project duration is 15 weeks, okay? So we have all of this information. So now we want to know what the probability of finishing this project is, having it done by that 16th week. Well, we need something called a Z-score. You remember those from statistics? Well, it's not as difficult either as it was in statistics. What we're going to do is we're going to use a very simple formula. Z is equal to due date minus expected date divided by the project standard deviation. So we said we had a due date of 16 weeks. Our project duration, we expect to have it done in 15 weeks. And we know that our project standard deviation is 1.76 weeks. So when we calculate this, we come up with a z-score of 0.57. Now what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything until you use a normal distribution table. On a normal distribution table, you can come and you can find the 5, the 0.5 on the side, on the left-hand side, and the 0.07. Where they meet is at 0.7157. What that means to you is that there's a 71.57% probability that you will finish this project by the 16th week. Are you worried? You should be. Your boss should be worried. Because that also means that you have over a 28% probability of not being finished on time. So pretty scary stuff. But the point that I would like to make is now, rather than giving your boss a swag answer, you know, I'm guilty of that. The boss will come and say, well, what's the likelihood that we're going to be finished with the information for that new class that you're putting online by August? And I'll say, oh, it's 99%. Well, now I don't just have to guess, okay? I can go back and I can calculate that. And I can tell my boss, based on the numbers, I can tell you that there is less than a 72% probability that we will be finished on time. Great stuff.
Okay. Swag, by the way, did anybody look that up?
I did. I don't think I found the right answer though.
No, I don't know what the right answer is. Swag in my travels is a scientific wild ass guess. And I think that's what she was referring to. And I don't see why you can't say that on a video, but anyway.
It says swag is just another word for the promotional products that many businesses use to promote their
Yeah,
products.
that's marketing department. The swag at the Oscars, you get a swag bag with, if you're invited to the Oscars. Next time you're invited to the Oscars, you'll get a swag bag. That's the other term for it. Maybe the one that I used is just one I learned in engineering school. I don't know.
Here's another one. Swag is used to describe an estimate derived from a combination of factors including past experience, general impressions, and heuristic or approximate calculations rather than an exhaustive search, proof, or rigorous calculation.
Yeah, so wild ass guess.
Wikipedia, scientific wildness guess.
Yeah, yeah. So it's based on your experience. It's the best guesstimate you have. So we're not going to go to the point in right away of having to figure out standard deviation and know what the probability of your project is. I wanted you to see that the PERT method is based on 3 estimates of time, and we've been doing that all of our life, really. We're saying best case scenario, worst case scenario, what's probably going to happen. And we do that when we put in a new piece of equipment. We go, okay, it's going to get delivered on Monday. Best case is we plug it in and it works. We'll be using it on Tuesday. And the worst case is you plug it in, it doesn't work. We have to have a service company come out. It's going to take us 2 weeks to get it installed correctly, and we're not going to use it for 3 weeks. That's a worst case scenario. In reality, what's going to happen? It'll come in on Monday. Maybe it'll come in on Tuesday, and by midweek we'll be using it. And that's the highest probability based on our experience for this new router we're going to get in or whatever it is. And so we've been using that kind of thing, but how do you put that into a number, how that's going to affect your project? That's what this is about. It's simply giving you a glimpse of saying we can do that. And I don't expect you to have memorized what you saw in that video. Lots and lots of references. I'll teach it again later in the class. But we're simply looking at those 3 time estimates, looking at what the probability is and taking the variance from it and doing a standard deviation from that standard deviation, and then doing a Z-score, which is a predicted distribution That's science, that's statistics. If you wanna go that deep, you can do that, and then with some authority, you can talk to your bosses about the timelines and the things that they've configured. But in the real world, we probably won't do that at first. We'll have to walk before we run on that. But that stuff's not out of any of our grasp. You do not have to be a PhD statistician to do that. You saw what she just did. It's all based on guesses in the first place. When we take a task and we say, what is the duration of that task? That's contingent on stuff. It's contingent on us not running out of materials. It's contingent on it not raining, or we started in time, and it's got all kinds of things. It's a guess. And so we're taking guesses and trying to make science out of it. Well, that's the job of a project manager, is take people's guesses and try to make something. Every time a president of a company projects how much money, Apple, the president of Apple projects how much money they think they're gonna make the first quarter of the next fiscal year, and they tell Wall Street. That's a guess. And then investors invest based on that guess. And what's the probability of that guess being right on and being wrong? We know from experience that sometimes they get it, sometimes they underestimate, and sometimes they overestimate. They don't nail it. We're guessing about guesses. And that's what project management is at, is we got guesses, and we're trying to reduce it down to the point where we can invest money and get that money back based on our skill sets to drive the project. So that's really what we want to do. It's time to take a break. We'll take a break, and we're going to come back and we're going to look at how do we crash the timeline. We've looked at how to make the timeline. Maybe I won't do it in that order, but we'll come back from the break and we'll do something. So take a break right now. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Those videos supposed to be on Canvas to reference them?
Yes, they will.
That's,
Yeah, they will. They're not. Sure.
So, pretty bizarre.
Since Tuesday. Okay, that's awesome. Maybe.
I don't know.
Okay.
Seems like something opens, another one opens to challenge it.
Okay.
So, put it aside, then, because I was in class, was the
this out without using this right here, you know what I mean? I wanted to be able to do it, but,
My second one. Set lower slotted than the first one.
First one, right.
Was trying to read this and understand what, using the answer thing.
right.
Trying to understand.
Yeah, and right here it gives you, so when you turn the page, it has everything already filled out for you, right? And I was trying to, do it without it, so I can understand it, you know what I mean? But because of this number right here is a one, and I started with a zero, none of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
My early start and my late finish don't add up.
Yeah,
These
'cause
numbers don't add up.
the method's gonna be different, right? So,
Yeah.
depending on whether it's zero or one.
Well, the math is different.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you turn this into a zero, then this all becomes accurate, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what I did right there, so this late start right here needs to be 17 better across the board. That's right. Okay. All right. Yeah, well, so on my late finish, right, is the overall duration, right? So if it's 17 to 1, whatever the greatest number is what it is for all of them. So the latest they can end.
Yes, I like how the guys are in there.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So if I start with that. All right. Figured it out.
First one figured out.
Good Lord, no. I am not.
So you're really taking notes. My notes are so fast, too.
Well, I've got the formulas, right, and PERT is an estimated duration, right, and critical path is a certain duration. So there's only gonna be one time frame on the critical path. You're gonna say it's going to take this long for each task, you know,
Yeah.
and on PERT, estimate, right?
So would you perfectly unknowns?
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah.
critical path where it's more direction where you
Where you know what it's gonna be, right? So what you say is that this is the,
We'll see, we'll figure it out. Yeah,
an estimated time,
there's always,
this is the,
opposition to everything.
door open, might takes, and this is the estimated.
Most likely.
Almost like,
Well, right, but see, it,
Steak or lobster?
most likely, but it goes to prove that like their charge, it was almost all of it was, what this looks like, so you can see, yeah, these that we, she did the calculations,
right.
except for all the really high estimates. And then Z chart where we get that.
It's like I'm watching and I understand, I get it, but
What you call it, Z calculation?
a Z.
Okay, we're
chart, or Z scale.
back and my voice is less strong, so we're gonna look at a couple more activity on Node, to kind of underscore kind of where we're at on that. Because a couple of you had some light bulbs come on, and I think that was good. So we'll watch about 25 minutes of more on activity on Node, and then we'll look at crashing, and then we'll be done for the day. So let's, or I'll be done for the day.
there. In this video, I'll illustrate how to draw an AON, or Activity on Node project network, for a series of 8 activities, and then identify the paths as well as the critical path. So the table you see here provides us all of the information on the 8 activities, the immediate predecessors, and how long each activity takes in days. Our objective is simple: to determine how long it should take Dave and his team to complete the project, and what are the critical path activities. So I've already drawn some activity nodes here to get us started. As we can see, the first activity is A and has no immediate predecessors, so that's the one that we're going to start with. Then we look at activity B, and we see that actually both B and C have A as an immediate predecessor. So what we can do then is grab each of the activities B and C and put them in our map, something like that. And then we can join them with a couple of lines here. The next activity, actually the next 2 activities, both D and E, have B as an immediate predecessor. So we can grab those 2 activities, take D, and let's say put that bullet there on our chart, and then we'll grab activity E and pull that one somewhere around there like that, and add a couple of lines to join them. So now that we've completed those, activity F has activity C as its immediate predecessor, so F is going to come down a little bit lower about here in our diagram, something like that. And then we see activity G comes off of activity D. We'll take G, put it about there. And then activity H has both E and F as immediate predecessors. So we'll grab activity H, put it somewhere about there, so it looks something like that. And then we will join them. Now you'll notice that G and H are the last activity nodes, and they actually need to come to an end. So we're going to create an oval to represent an endpoint. And we'll just move that a little bit closer so that activities G and H can then come to that endpoint. We call this endpoint a dummy node. And we only need to use it if we have more than one activity that's the last one in the list. Now, because we've added an end node, then it's also good practice to, at the same time, add a begin node. So that's what our AON diagram should look like. I usually draw the diagrams first based on the predecessor relationships and then put in the activity times. So we will now put the activity times. A takes 3 days, B takes 4, C takes 6 days, D takes also 6 days, E is 4, F is 4, G is 6, and H is 8. So there we have our completed diagram. Now what we can do is identify all the paths that we have. A path is just following the arrows all the way through the diagram. So for example, one of the paths that we have is A, B, D, G, and end. So I'm going to list that as one of the paths. We have paths A, B, D, and G. And what we can also do at the same time is determine how long or how many days it takes if we went along that path. So A is 3 days, B is 4, D is 6, plus 6, that's a total of 19 days. So path A, B, D, G is 19 days. We have another path that's A, B, E, H, and A, B, E, H. And if we add all those days up together, 3, 4, 4, and 8, that will equal also 19 days. Well, you can see that there's still one path left. A, C, F, H, End is the last path. A, C, F, H, and that's 3, 6, 4, and 8, for a total of 21 days. So now, as you can see in our diagram, we have 3 paths. ABDG, 19 days, ABEH takes 19 days, and ACFH takes 21 days. The path that has the longest time is known as the critical path. So in our example here, the critical path is ACFH, and will take 21 days to complete. The project cannot be completed in less than 21 days.
Okay, we're going to pause here for a second because I did not close out before we went on break. Sorry, I'm not as cognizant as I ought to be, I guess, today. The last row is going to talk about the PERT diagram and the CPM critical path method a little bit. Let's just get a comment or two. If you can remember back 5 minutes earlier than what we just saw. What were some of the notes that sprung in your mind as you watched that, Eric?
CPM, for example, just like the first one, it was really confusing at first when I was going over the last couple nights, but now seeing it, in action, I guess you could say, and somebody explaining one of the layman's terms, it makes a ton of more sense now. And then the first one without variance, equated to this one's a little tough to read down, I felt like.
That's going to be tougher to digest because it's got that statistics in there.
But I did like how it gets it down to basically an exact percentage, of what your completion could be,
What the real probability is.
probability exactly.
Where that will really make a difference to the corporate management is, let's suppose I've got 5 patios underway at Stewart Awning, and that, just a low number, maybe 1 crew, that's what's underway. I've got 2 weeks left in the quarter, the end of the month, right? And I want to know, what's our billing going to be this month? What's the probability we're going to get these jobs finished and invoiced? Because we got money that they owe us when we get done. And all companies have money that's tied to shipping, right? If you're a production company. And so looking at the projects that we have underway, if it's production, that's different, but the patios are custom and in many cases. And so we've got projects that need to be, what's the probability we'll get this one finished by this date? This was finished by this date. And once we add that up, we say, adding these 5 jobs up is, $500,000 worth of business or $200,000 worth of business, whatever it is. And we will finish them and we will collect them, but what's the probability of getting it by December 31st, which is the end of our year? And so we want to try to project our cash needs and our cash, what our money will be for cash flow purposes. So now giving project confidence information to the finance people, that gives them an idea of how comfortable they can be with knowing what the cash flow requirements and the cash receipts are going to be for the company based on the project that's coming in. That's of super importance to the owners of the company, because they need to make sure your payroll, your paychecks don't bounce, right? They need to make sure there's enough money there for the cash flow for the company. And we'll be talking about that in more detail next module. It's about money. So we'll be talking about the money at that point in time. So there's a couple of thoughts. What did you get from the video?
It was kind of confusing at first because we were going from paper to the video, and the 1 and 0 is confusing at first, but if both are right, and just understanding the equation, go from there. And I really enjoy looking at the formulas they give you to narrow down the exact percentage of what needs to be done.
That's a cool thing if we can get there. That's a very cool thing. Kelly?
I was kind of confused the whole time because I kept zoning out. There was holes in the middle. I was on, but then learned that the critical path method is used for situations where you're sure about the timing line, usually. And then
Bert, you're right so far.
yeah. And then PERT uses 4 different time estimates, the optimistic time estimates, and the cycle time.
That was at the very beginning of that video. That's a super critical piece for us to grab. Well, if we don't know much about the timeline, we're guessing more on timeline, PERT's going to be a better tool for us to use in critical path. Critical path is only as accurate as the numbers we're given in there, right? And if the numbers are all funky, then critical path's not going to be critical path. What we think is a critical path was all based on somebody's optimistic guesses, and we'd be better off with the PERT method. So good to pick that up. Jake, what'd you get?
To close it up by saying that both have a spot in your toolbox. The PERT method for accuracy, or like we were talking about, you can have your best guess, worst guess, and probably what's going to happen. And then the easier method is more so that you can kind of get it mapped out real fast and
That's right, and
I like
that's the way it was presented, and as we look at crashing the model, which we're gonna be doing next after a couple more short clips like we just watched, that, now we're gonna be putting numbers to, you know, cause if we move a 1 week, a 2 week projection into a 1 week, cause that's all the time we got left, that's gonna cost us more. And so we're gonna have to put, you know, overtime or double labor time, you know, gonna have to move the numbers when we crash the model, because things are gonna change. And so we'll add that piece to it in a little while, that's an important thing to either model, the critical path or the PERT model. All right, so, we're gonna watch a couple more 5-minute clips like that on the activity on Node that we've been looking at. The same guy, that we watched just now, and on this one, those of you on the second row are going to answer back a little bit on this after we've watched 2 of these, number 2 and 3. Perhaps.
Hello there. In this video, we'll go through another Activity on Node project network that includes drawing the diagram, identifying the critical path, and also drawing a Gantt chart for the project. So here's the data that we have for a factory. At this time, we have 7 activities with the time measured in hours. We can see right from the get-go that activities A and B have no immediate predecessors, so both of those could start at the same time. What I've done is pre-populated my nodes with the times to begin with. So let's start to draw this diagram. So we'll start with A and B, and then we see activity C comes off of activity A, and activity D comes off of both B and C. So we put activity C about there, and activity D about there, and we start to draw our lines. C comes after A, and D comes after both B and C. Then we have activity E, which comes after activity B. So we'll put this one sort of down here. Activity F comes after activity D, and then activity G comes off of both E and F. So it'll look something like that. Now notice again that activity E comes after both B and C. So when we join them, we have to make sure that we include B and C. And then activity F comes after activity D. Now if we joined it just like that, you see we've got a crossover, and that's okay to have a crossover, but usually what we do in operations is we kind of do a little hop like that. Not as pretty as the other ones, but it gets the job done. And then activity G comes after both E and F. Now since G is the last node, and it's the only one at the end, we don't need to have an end node. But because A and B both start at the same time, we want to include a start node at the very beginning. So that's what our diagram should look like here. If we list the paths, you can see that we have A, C, D, E, F, G. It's a long one. And 6 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7.7 plus 4 is 28.7 hours. The next path is A, C, E, and G. And when we add those together, that's 19.5 hours. We have another path that's B, D, F, G. That's a total of 24.9 hours. And then we have another path that's just B, E, G for a total of 15.7. So what we see here is that of all these paths, the longest path is A, C, D, F, G for a total of 28.7 hours. This is the critical path because it takes the longest amount of time. So we've actually finished requirements A and B to draw the network diagram and identify the path. And of course, at the same time, we've determined that the projected length of the project is 28.7 hours. The last thing we want to do is draw a Gantt chart for the project. And so I'm just going to paste one in here because it's going to be quicker that way. So as you can see here, we have a line for each activity. So we start with A, and we know that A takes 6 hours. So this endpoint here is at about 6 hours. B starts at 0 and takes 7.2 hours. So this point here is 7.2 hours. Activity C cannot start until activity A is finished. So that's why these line up. So activity C starts at the 6-hour point and then takes a total of 5 hours to complete, to finish at the 11th hour. If you were to draw these to scale, that would be about here. It's the 11th hour. Then activities D and E cannot start until activity C is finished. So all of these start at hour 11. Activity D takes 6 hours. Activity E takes 4.5. So 11 plus 6, this would be at 17. 11 plus 4.5, this is 15.5. And then activity F cannot start until activity D is complete. So that starts at the 17 hours, takes 7.7 to end at the 24.7 hour mark. And then activity G cannot begin until activity F is complete, takes 4.0. And when we add 4.0 to 24.7, this ends at 28.7 hours. So that's a quick Gantt chart for it. And the nice thing about the Gantt chart is you can see which activities overlap, and you can also see which activities must begin after its predecessor is complete. So that's how you draw an AON diagram and a Gantt chart.
Okay. Next one. On the same topic, same guy.
Hello there. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to draw an activity on node or AON project network, and also to determine what the earliest start and finish times and the latest start and finish times are, as well as identifying any slack and what the critical path is. This example is based on problems 310 and 311 in your text. And what I've done is combine them into one video. So here we have a list of activities in the first table. We've got 8 tasks ranging from activity A all the way to activity H. The first table just identifies what the predecessor relationships are, and then the second table for the same set of activities, A through H, identifies the time it takes. So what I've done is created activity nodes in advance for A through H, each with the respective completion times in weeks, from 6 all the way through to 7 weeks. So our first objective is to construct an AON network for these activities. So let's go ahead and do that. You can see that both A and B do not have any predecessors, so both of those are our beginning nodes. Then, if we look at activities C and D, both succeed activity A. So we'll put activity C about here, activity D about here. And then if you look at activities E and F, they are immediately preceded by B. So we'll take E, put it about there, and F, we can put it about here. We can even move B down a little bit, just to center it a little bit nicer between those two. And G is preceded by activities C and E. So if we take G, well, I guess it kind of doesn't matter where we put them because C is at the top and E is further down, so we'll put activity G about here. And H is preceded by D and F, so we'll put this something like that here. And now we can join with our arrows. Now you also notice that we don't have a single start or end node, so what we're going to have to do is insert a couple of ovals, and there we have it. There is our completed network diagram, and that in essence solves the requirement to problem 3.10. After putting in the activity times, our second objective is to determine what's called the earliest start and earliest finish times, also known as ES and EF, and the latest start and latest finish times, also known as LS and LF, for each activity, as well as the slack. We'll also be able to determine the project completion time and the critical path. So in the diagram, I've already included the activity times. And in order to figure out the earliest start and finish times, we can do something called a forward pass. So both of the activities, A and B, start at time 0. So we'll start with activity A first. That starts at 0. Well, 0 plus 6 means that activity A will end after 6 weeks. These are known as the earliest start and earliest finish. So the earliest activity A can start is immediately, but the earliest it can finish is in 6 weeks. If we look at activity B, of course, it can start immediately, and if we add the 7 weeks that it takes, the earliest it can finish is in 7 weeks. So again, earliest start, earliest finish. And then what we need to do is make our way through the diagram. So we'll go back to activity A, and you can see that both C and D come after activity A. So what's going to happen is the earliest finish time from activity A becomes the earliest start time for activity C. ES of 6 plus 3 equals an earliest finish time of 9 weeks. If you look at activity D, that 6 weeks also becomes the earliest start time for activity D. It takes 2 weeks to complete, so the earliest we can finish is at the end of week 8. If we go back down to B and look at activities E and F, which succeeded, the earliest activity E can start is in 7 weeks. It takes 4 weeks to complete, so the earliest that it can be completed is in 11 weeks. F can also start on the 7th week, plus 6 weeks means that the earliest it can finish is 13. Activity G is preceded by both C and E. Now this is interesting. So what we have to do is we have to look for the larger number of the two. Activity C's earliest finish is 9 weeks, but activity E's earliest finish is 11 weeks. So that means that the earliest that G can start is in 11 weeks. It takes 10 weeks to complete, and so the earliest it can finish is in 21 weeks. If we look at activity H, it's preceded by D and F. Well, the earliest that activity D can be complete is in 8 weeks, and the earliest finish for activity F is 13. Well, we must take the larger of the two numbers, which is going to be the 13 weeks, add 7, because that's how long activity H takes, and that will be 20 weeks. Now we can determine when the project can be complete. Well, remembering from all the other examples that we had done, the highest number, or the longest time in the critical path, is how long the project takes. So that is 21 weeks, which is the earliest that we can finish. So that's a forward pass, and we use that to determine the earliest start and the earliest finish times. Well, we're also asked to determine the latest start and the latest finished. Well, in order to determine those, we're going to use a backward pass, which means we're going to work backwards through the diagram, and we use that to determine the latest start and latest finish. And we'll do this in red. So the latest finish time for the project is 21 weeks. And because the last activities are G and H, which means that the latest that H can be completed is in 21 weeks. And if we take 21 minus 7, this gives us 14 weeks. So the 21 is the latest finish, and 14 weeks is the latest start. If we just look at this node, that means that the earliest start time for activity H is 13 weeks, the earliest finish is 20 weeks, the latest start is 14, the latest finish is 21. We need to work on activity G and carry 21, take 21 minus 10, that's 11. So now continuing to work through, if we look at G, G's preceded by C and E. It doesn't matter which one we go with first, we can go with E. You can see that the latest that E can start is 11 weeks, 11 minus 4 is 7. If we look at activity C, the latest it can finish is 11 weeks, minus 3 is 8. If we look at activity H and feed that back through D, that means that the latest D can start is 14 weeks, minus the 2 weeks that it takes, means that the latest that D can start is in 12 weeks. Activity F also precedes activity H, so the latest it can finish is 14 weeks, minus 6 is 8. We're getting close to the end here. If we look at activity B, you can see that B is preceded by both E and F, but what we have to do is take the smaller number. The latest start for E is 7 weeks, and the latest start for F is 8 weeks. We bring back the smaller number, so 7 minus 7 is 0. If we look at activity A, it's preceded by activities C and D, but what we have to do is take the smaller number back, so we'll take 8 minus 6 is 2. And that means that activity A, the latest that it can start is 2 weeks, the latest it can finish is in 8 weeks. So what this means is that With a forward pass to determine the earliest start and finish lines, we carry forward the larger predecessor time. But when we're looking at a backward pass to calculate the latest start and finish times, we carry back the smaller successor times. So that's the rule of thumb. So for each of these nodes, we now have an earlier start and earlier finish. Now what we can do is we can put all this into a table. So what I've done is I pre-populated the table for all of the activities that include their times. And from our diagram that we already have, we can determine we can fill in the earliest start and finish times and then identify the critical path. You can identify the critical path from the visual as well. I mean, as you can see, by working through, the critical path is actually going to be B, E, G for 21 weeks. But what we can do is prove that using our table. So activity A, the earliest it can start is at time 0 immediately. It takes 6 weeks to complete, so the earliest that it can finish is 6. Activity B is 0 and 7. Activity C then, because it's preceded by A, the earliest that it can start is 6, takes 3 weeks and gives us 9, so 6 plus 3 is 9. For activity D, we see that the earliest it can start is 6, 8. Again, if we look at activity E from our diagram, the earliest it can start is 7, takes 4 weeks, 11, so 7 plus 4 is 11. Activity F, 7 plus 6 is 13. Activity G, 11 is the earliest it can start. It takes 10, so it gives us 21 weeks. And activity H, the earliest it can start is 13 weeks, plus 7 is 20. And then summarizing the backward pass, the latest that activity A can start is 2 weeks, and the latest finish is 8. B is 0 and 7. C is 8 and 11. D is 12 and 14. E, 7 and 11. F, 8 and 14. G, 11 and 21. And H, 14 and 21. The next thing that we can do is calculate what's called the slack. And the slack is just the difference between any of the earliest start and latest starts, or earliest finish and latest finish. And it doesn't matter which one you choose. So if we look at activity A, for example, the difference between the earliest and latest start times is 2. Well, the difference between the latest start and finish times is 8 minus 6 is also 2. Well, if we see this in the table, we can take, doesn't matter, the earliest start and earliest finish, 8 minus 6 gives us a slack of 2. Well, that means, slack means that the activity isn't critical and that we can actually delay when we start it. So we don't have to start activity A immediately. We can actually wait 2 weeks to start it if we needed the time, or if we needed to allocate resources to another activity or a different project. If we look at activity B, notice that the difference between the latest start and finish is 7 minus 7 is 0, and also the earliest start and finish is 0. Activity C, we have slack of 11 minus 9, or 8 minus 6, which is 2. D, 14 minus 8, or 12 minus 6 is 6. E has 0 slack because 11 minus 11, or 7 minus 7 is 0. F, so 14 minus 13 is 1, or 8 minus 7 is 1. G has slack of 0, and H has slack of 1. Now what you'll notice is that any activity that has 0 slack actually lies on the critical path. There can be no delay as to when the activity starts and finishes. All other activities are not on the critical path, and therefore all have slack. So if we had resources like individuals that we needed to deploy elsewhere, we could wait 2 weeks for activity A to start and put them on another project. Activity D, in fact, has the most slack with 6 weeks, which means that any of these resources that we use for activity D can be put onto another project, as long as they're brought back by week 12, which is the latest start time, to keep the project on task. So that's how we draw an AOA project network and use a forward pass to determine the earliest start and finish times, and a backward pass to determine the latest start and finish times, which help us identify the critical path.
All right, let's talk about that for a second. What did you pick up out of that word? Got a little redundancy out right? We're kind of getting comfortable with this a little bit. Really? Say that louder. It is the same. Yeah, it's like, okay, some of you got it the first time, you don't need it the second time. Some of us took 2 times, some of them take a 3rd time. And it's the same thing, we can get this. What did you get?
Yeah, I noticed it was pretty similar to each other. I know on that first one, it also did the Gantt chart as well, which kind of, I guess, helped out for me because the Gantt chart is a little bit more simple in my head. But then also, I liked how I was talking about the slack time. It went a little bit more in depth in the slack time here, trying to say, with that slack time, you kind of want to put those resources elsewhere, especially for business. If you got slack time, you don't want to pay, you don't want to pay somebody to, just sit around and wait until the next task comes. Kind of want to try and figure out another project for them.
Right. So that's gonna be helpful in allocation of resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the final chart that he laid out there at the end that showed all the slack times kind of coinciding with the activities was really helpful for that allocation of resources and deciding what needs to happen when. As well as, I think the Gantt chart I really didn't like very much personally. I think one of my issues with it is that, at least in the chart that he showed us, if you have multiple end points, I guess it just didn't really show that, hey, like, this might be the end of a chain, or if 2 things go into one, you only know that the last one goes into that next one. Or it just, there were certain things where if you had a hang up, then all of a sudden you're trying to figure out, which goes to what, or I guess it could get very confusing very quickly, I think, personally.
The 3 charts that you saw at the very last, they essentially had the same information on them if you derived it from it, but they're painting pictures in different ways. And the dependency is very clear from the first chart. The Gantt chart shows us, kind of where we're at progress-wise visually. It's the same information, but it's more visual about where we're at delivery-wise. And the table, shows us where the zeros are at. It pops out. That's critical path stuff. You got no room for error there. And so the 3 charts are very similar in terms of what the information, they're exactly the same in terms of what the information that you get. But there are 3 ways of painting the picture or drawing.
So when they have the nodes out like that, is there a way, like with the Gantt chart, you can put a line saying this is where we're at today?
Absolutely.
Does it still work for the nodes as well?
It's harder to see. Yes, it does work through the nodes if the nodes are written proportionate to time. Usually they're not. The Gantt chart, every unit is incremental in time. It's the same. In the first diagram, it's just they're in order, but not with the time increment accurately depicted. So the Gantt chart gives you the ability to put the time sequence in there.
I don't necessarily know that this is noteworthy, but I found it interesting because it brought clarity that I didn't think I needed. So when you can't place one of the nodes in a specific spot to meet the path that it's intended to go in, and a line has to cross, and they do the hump, it brought a lot of clarity to the idea that the path isn't necessarily connected one to the other.
No.
Like it's not going to like the 2 projects aren't going to meet at any point in time. It's intended just to keep flowing, just to go right past.
From
And so,
one activity to the next.
right, and so it's I don't know. I found that interesting. Like I said, I don't know if that's noteworthy,
Yeah.
but it was interesting.
Okay. Thank you. We've got one final, I believe, we want to look at on this, and we're going to look at crashing the schedule. So what happens when we get a group that we need to address? So one more little bit redundance, okay, and we're going through it to make sure we all got it.
Hello there. In this video, we'll demonstrate how to take a set of activities and create a Gantt chart, as well as an activity on node project network. This problem corresponds to exercises 3.8 and 3.9 in your textbook. So the data for our problem is the city of Lethbridge deciding to build a garden and picnic area, and we're provided with a precedence table for other activities to construct, and our requirement will be to draw the Gantt chart for the whole construction activity. So we have planning, that's the first activity, but then we have purchasing that is preceded by planning, which would be A. Excavation is activity C, which is also preceded by planning. Sawing, activity D, is preceded by purchasing, so that's activity B. Placement is preceded by both sawing and excavation, so both C and D. Assembly comes after placement, which is E. Activity G, infill, comes after assembly, which is F. Outfill also comes after assembly, which is F. And decoration must come after both infill and outfill, so that is G and H. So let's now proceed with drawing the Gantt chart for this project. Okay, let's start with this Gantt chart. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this fairly quickly and simply is using Excel. So what I've done is I've pre-created a table that includes all the activities from planning through to decoration, labeled A through I, and then use my column widths to set the cell widths to be smaller. That way, instead of having very wide cells, you can have square-shaped cells. What I also did is I set the scale for time, which in this question is in hours, for each single block to represent 10 hours. So we'll start with activity A, planning. And you can see that activity A takes 20 hours to complete, so that would be 2 blocks. We'll select 2 blocks and we'll highlight it green. Then purchasing comes after planning, so that means purchasing is going to start here and it takes 60 hours, so that's going to be 6 blocks. I'm also going to note here that planning ends after 20 hours, and then purchasing will add another 60 hours to the total time, leaving us at 80. Activity C is excavation, and it comes after planning, which is activity A. So excavation would start here, and it takes 100 hours, so that's going to be 10 blocks, and 20 plus 100 is 120. The next activity is sawing, which happens after purchasing, so we'll start here at 80 hours and takes 30 hours to complete, so that's 3 blocks. That will put us at 110 hours. Placement takes place after both sawing and excavation, which is C and D, but because C takes the longest, placement cannot start until the 120 hour mark. It takes 20 hours, so 2 blocks, which puts us now at 140 hours. Activity F, for assembly, takes place after placement. So that means it starts at 140, takes 1 time block for 10 hours, which would put it at the end of 150 hours. Activity G is infill. It takes place after assembly, so it will begin at the 150 hour mark and take 20 hours to complete. So that puts us at 170 hours. Activity H, outfill, also happens after assembly. It takes 10 hours, so that would put us at 160 hours. And then the last activity, decoration, takes place after infill and outfill, but infill is the longest predecessor, so decoration cannot start until infill is complete, and it takes 30 hours or 3 blocks, and that brings us to 200 hours. So what this Gantt chart shows us is that all the activities sequenced properly will take 200 hours. What we can also do with the Gantt chart is use it to identify the critical path. So we'll start with A, because that's the first one, it's always on the critical path, and we'll highlight that one yellow. Then we look for the next longest activity, and we can see that that's activity C, or excavation. And then what immediately succeeds excavation is placement, followed by assembly, then infill, and then decoration. So now we've determined that the critical path is A, C, E, F, G, I, for a total of 200 hours. And there you have it. That's the Gantt chart for this question. Okay, so now I've gone and placed our completed Gantt chart into our question space here, and our next requirement, which refers to question 3.9 and is based on the table in 3.8, we want to draw the activity on node network for the construction activity. So what I've done in advance is created some activity nodes for A through I along with their times. Now let's go ahead and let's draw the A1 map. We know we start with activity A, and then activity B comes immediately after activity A, and activity C also comes after activity A, so we can put it about there. And if we want, we can make A kind of center with those. There's no right or wrong way to draw these diagrams, just whatever looks the best. Activity D comes after activity B. Activity E comes after activity C, so we can put that over here. Activity F comes after activity E. Activity G comes after activity activity F, and activity H also comes after activity F, and then finally activity I comes after both G and H. And let's now draw our lines, and there's our finished AON diagram. Because we have a single start node and end node for A and I, we don't need to have dummy nodes. And now let's identify all of the paths. So our first path can be A, B, D, E, F, G, and I. And when you add all those up together, that will work out to 190 hours. Our next path, let's do in green, will be A, B, D, E, F, H, and I. And that will take 180 hours. Our next path can be A, C, E, F, G, and I. That one will take 200 hours. And our last path will be A, C, E, F, H, I. And that takes, when you add all the times up, 190 hours. Well, as you can see, that the critical path is the longest at 200 hours, which is A, C, E, F, G, I. But that's also what we identified as the critical path over here using the Gantt chart. So what you can see is that using both a Gantt chart or an AON diagram, you can identify what the critical path is. The AON diagram, however, is a little bit easier to identify all the paths than a Gantt chart is. And so there you have it. There's the answer to this problem, showing you how to draw a Gantt chart and an AON diagram, and using both to identify the critical path.
All right, we now want to switch gears to talk about crashing, crashing the project, and we've got 2 videos I want to show on that. I have a third, but we won't go through it. Crashing the project and how we can use that as a tool to get back on track with the project we're off.
Hello there. In this video, we will demonstrate how to crash a project with first by 1 week, and then as far as we can crash it. This question corresponds to problem 3.20 in your textbook. As you can see, we've been given a set of 7 activities along with their normal time, and we're also presented with the crash time. Now the crash time just means the crash time represents the absolute minimum amount of time the activity can take. We're also presented with the normal cost, so that would be the cost associated with completing the task in the normal time period. So for example, for activity A, it takes 4 weeks at a cost of $2,000. The crash cost would be the cost to complete the project in the reduced amount of time. So if activity A were to be completed in 3 weeks, then that would cost $2,600. And we're also provided with the immediate predecessors for all the tasks. Our objectives for the question are below. The first one is to determine the project completion date. Basically, you want to draw the network diagram and determine how long it takes to complete the project. So that's what I've done here. A, B, and C have no predecessors. D is preceded by A, E is preceded by B, F is preceded by C, G is preceded by both D and E. You can see that the project takes 16 weeks with a path of A, D, G, and end. The next question is asking, what's the total cost required for completing the project on the normal time? Well, that's simply the sum of all of the normal costs, which add up to $12,300, and those are the amounts all identified in blue. The third requirement is to say, well, if we want to reduce the completion time by 1 week, which activity should be crashed and how much will it increase the cost? So what we need to do now is take the information around the normal time and the crash time along with the cost information provided and basically determine a couple of things. One is to take the difference between the normal time and the crash time. So for activity A, we have a normal time of 4 weeks minus a crash time of 3 weeks equals 1 week. B, 2 minus 1 is 1, etc. We've completed that in advance for all of these activities. Then we want to take the difference between the costs. So we take the crash cost minus the normal cost. And you see what I also did here is actually numbered my columns. So the normal time minus the crash time is column 5, and that's just the difference between column 1 minus column 2. Column 6 here is the crash time minus the normal time, and that's the difference between the crash cost, which is column 4, minus the normal cost, which is column 3. So for activity A, the crash cost is $2,600, but the normal cost is $2,000 for a difference of $600. Activity B, $2,800 crash cost minus $2,200, normal cost is a $400 difference. Activity C, for example, cannot be crashed actually because its normal time is equal to the crash time and zero cost. So you can stop the video and make sure you can confirm all these numbers. The last column is the most important. It helps us determine the crash cost per period, or in this case per week. And to do this, we just simply take the columns we just calculated. We take column 6 divided by column 5. So for activity A, we take the $600 difference between the crash cost and normal cost and divide it by the difference between the normal time and the crash time. And that's $600. Activity B, 400 divided by 1 is $400, etc. Incidentally, column 5 here also tells us the maximum amount of time each activity can be crashed. We can call that the max crash. So now what we want to do is complete that requirement. If we were to reduce the amount of time by 1 week, which activity would we pick? Once we've calculated the crash cost, essentially what we want to do is first look at the critical path. The critical path is ADG. So that means that if we want to reduce the time it takes to complete the project, we have to look first at the critical path. Crashing any other activity that's not on the critical path will just cost money and not reduce the project time. So once we know the critical path is ADG, we then look and see which cost is the lowest, because we want to crash as economically as possible. And so we see that activity D is the lowest cost. Now, what I've also done down here is created a list of all the activities and the crash times as identified in the table above. So 3, 1, 3, 4, etc. Then I also listed here each path. So we have 3 paths in the project: ADG, which takes 16 weeks. We have BEG, which would take 12 weeks, and CF, which would take 6 weeks. Remember that the longest path is a critical path, so we must first look at the critical path. So if we want to crash by 1 week, we would look at the critical path and identify D as the least expensive option. So we would crash activity D times 1 week, because that's all we're asked to do, times a cost of $75. And that results in a total cost of $75. But now here's what happens, and this is important. If we crash activity D by 1 week, that means D would now take 7 weeks to complete. We can change this in our table here. So 4 plus 7 is now 11 weeks. That makes the earliest start time for G 11 weeks, plus 4 is 15, and now the project will end in 15 weeks. And so if we subtract 1 from the critical path, that's 15 weeks. So we've essentially answered the question here to part C. We would crash D and the total cost of $75. Now we want to look at what's the maximum time that the project can be crashed, and by how much will that increase the costs. So now what we're going to do is see how far we can take this project down. So looking at our path list, we can see that the critical path is still ADG. So we must first look to find any savings on that path. We always want to start with the least expensive option, which happens to still be activity D. We can crash activity D by 3 more weeks because the lowest we can go is to 4 weeks. So what we'll do now is we will crash activity D times 3 weeks at a cost of $75 per week for a total cost of $225. So here's what this does. It now takes another 3 weeks off and now gets us to 4, at which point we can no longer crash activity D. So we would subtract 3, and that gets us to 12 weeks. And that brings the project time down to 12 weeks. If we look at our map, we would say, okay, we would take another 3 weeks off to result in the lowest possible completion time of 4 weeks. That makes this 8. So the earliest G could start is 8 weeks, takes 4 weeks to complete, and 8 plus 4 is 12. Now there's something very interesting. If you look at our path list, path ADG is 12 weeks, but path BEG is also 12 weeks. Now we have 2 critical paths. So if we want to reduce the project time even further, what we have to do is either find one task that's common to both paths, or crash at least one activity on each path separately. So if we go back to our cost list, let's get a couple things out of the way here. We know we can no longer crash activity D. So let's put a line through that. And if we look at our paths, we have ADG and BEG. Well, we can see that G is common to both paths. So we could look at reducing activity G first. But just to make sure, we'll look at A, B, and E to determine if those are less expensive. Well, activity A costs $600 to crash. Activity B, separately on its own, would cost $400, but then we would still need to crash something else on ADG. So let's go with crashing activity G. And we want to go as far down as we can. We can see that G can be crashed from 4 weeks to 2, so we might as well knock it down by 2 weeks. Times a cost of $300 per week is a total cost of $600 to crash activity G. What this does, so activity G now becomes 2. We would take 2 weeks off ADG and 2 weeks off BEG to get us down to 10 weeks. If we look back at our chart, this now becomes 2. 8 plus 2 is 10, and that brings the project down to 10 weeks. And actually see here, I forgot to crash this down to 12 and then 10. And that brings us down to 10 weeks. So now G is off the list for any activity to crash. We can still go further, but we have to make sure that we then select at least one activity off each path, because there's no longer any activity that's common to both paths. So we have no choice but to crash activity A times 1 week times $600 is 600. So this will take us down to 3, because that's as far as we can go. And then we must look at the BEG path. We see that of B or E, E is the least expensive. So we will crash E times 1 week, and that will cost 100 for a total cost of $100. So E gets crashed by 1. We then take 1 week off each, giving us 9 weeks, both still critical. A can no longer be crashed, so we can cross that one out. B and E can still be crashed, but ADG is still critical, and we can no longer crash any activities along that path. F can also be crashed, but again, it's not on the critical path. So in essence, that's as far as we can go. So in essence, what we've done is in 3 separate waves, so this was a wave, this was a wave, and then these two were a wave. So in essence, what we've done is we've been able to max crash for a total of 7 weeks, 1 from the first, plus 3, plus 2, plus 1 week in total. So that's 7 weeks for a total cost of $1,600 when we add all those together. And that in essence is the answer to activity D. The maximum time that can be crashed is 7 weeks at a cost of $1,600, and the project will end up taking 9 weeks, because if we go back to our diagram and reduce this by 1 is 3, that's 3, 3 plus 4 is 7, 7 plus 2 is 9, and we would cut E by 1, that makes us 7, and 7 plus 2 is 9. So these do take a little bit of practice. The recommendation is that you list all the paths as I have down here and identify your starting point, and with each wave of crashing, make sure that you know exactly how many weeks or days you have left on each path to identify if you come across more than one critical path. So as you saw, after our first 2 waves, we ended up having 2 critical paths, and then we had to crash activities on both paths in order to make it work properly.
I hope we followed that because there's an enormous gain there if we can manage that. We're going to look at one more, 7 more minutes, and we'll be done for the day. I think everybody did an evaluation, a little bit comments, except we didn't get the myth. We didn't mean to skip you there. So maybe at the end of this one, just as a final for the class, give your point of view on the crashing, and then we will be done for the week, and we'll pick up on Tuesday with the deep dive into your project.
This video will illustrate how to crash a project with 7 activities down to its maximum crash time. Here's the data for our problem. Stratagema Electronics manufactures drones for commercial use. The company CEO is considering producing drones for the mass market. The activities necessary to build a prototype and related data are provided in the following table. Here we have 7 activities A through G, their normal completion time in weeks, the crash time, which means the minimum time within which the activity can be completed, the normal cost associated with the normal time, and the crash cost, which is the cost after crashing the activities. We are also provided with the immediate predecessors so we can determine all of the paths to completion. There are 3 requirements for this problem. First is to determine the project completion date. Second, to crash this project to 10 weeks at the least cost. Third, to determine the maximum time to which the project can be crashed and at what cost. The first step involved in determining the completion time is easiest done by constructing a PERT/CPM diagram. I'll create one using the activity on node or AON approach. Activities A, B, and C have no immediate predecessors, so they can all start at the same time. Activity D is preceded by activity A. Activity E is preceded by activity B. Activity F is preceded by activity C. Activity G is preceded by both activities D and E. The project is complete once activities G and F are completed. Now we can determine all of the paths through the project along with their completion times. The first path is a DG with times of 3, 7, and 4 weeks for a total of 14 weeks. The next path is BEG with times of 2, 6, and 4 weeks for a total completion time of 12 weeks. The third path is CF with times of 1 and 2 weeks for a total of 3 weeks. Our critical path therefore is path ADG for a total of 14 weeks since it takes the longest time. Now let's proceed to requirement 2 to crash this project to 10 weeks. First, we want to calculate the maximum crash time for each activity, which is simply the normal time minus the crash time. For activity A, the maximum crash time is 1 week, calculated as the normal time of 3 weeks minus the crash time of 2 weeks. This means the most we can crash activity A is by 1 week. Activity B can also be crashed by only 1 week, calculated as 2 normal weeks minus 1 crash week. Activity C cannot be crashed at all since the normal time and the crash time are the same at 1 week. Activity D can be crashed by a maximum of 4 weeks, calculated as 7 weeks normal time minus 3 weeks crash time. The same methodology is applied to all remaining activities to end up with maximum crash times of 3 weeks for activity E, 1 week for activity F, and 2 weeks for activity G. Next, we want to determine what the crash cost per week is, and we calculate that by taking the crash cost minus the normal cost and then divide by the maximum crash time we just calculated. So for activity A, the crash cost per week is $600, calculated as $1,600 crash cost minus $1,000 normal cost, which equals $600, and then divided by the 1 week maximum crash time. For activity B, the crash cost per week is $700, calculated as $2,700 crash cost minus $2,000 normal cost, which equals $700, and then divided by the 1 week maximum crash time. The crash cost for activity C is 0 because it cannot be crashed. The crash cost for activity D is $75, calculated as the $1,600 crash cost minus the $1,300 normal cost, and then divide by 4 weeks maximum crash time. The same approach is applied to the remaining activities to end up with crash costs of $50 per week for activity E, $1,000 per week for activity F, and $250 per week for activity G. Now let's get crashing! Here, I'm listing the activities and their normal times. Then, I'm showing each path based on our diagram. Path 1 is a DG with a total completion time of 14 weeks. Path 2 is BEG with a completion time of 12 weeks. And path 3 is CF with a 3-week completion time. Recall our critical path is a DG with the longest time of 14 weeks. Now, I'm also showing the crash cost per week and max crash time for each activity. Notice that activity C is red, and I've now removed it from the paths, and that's because it cannot be crashed. To start crashing, we begin with the lowest cost activity that can be crashed on the critical path. Activity D, with a cost of $75, is the least expensive, and we can crash it by a maximum of 4 weeks, but we'll only crash by 2 weeks right now, because we have to be mindful of our other paths. Path 2 is 12 weeks, and that path will become critical if we reach 12 weeks or less. In the blue area, I'm summarizing my approach. Path 1 started at 14 weeks, and we crashed 2 to end up with 12 weeks. We did not crash any activities on paths 2 or 3, so their completion times remain the same, but notice now that path 1 and 2 are both at 12 weeks, so they are now both critical. So after crashing activity D by 2 weeks at a cost of $75 per week for a total cost of $150, we now have 2 critical paths, A, D, G, and B, E, G, for a total of 12 weeks, and activity D can be crashed by only 2 more weeks. In our next wave, we have to look at both critical paths and crash activities that are either common to both, or crash activities on both paths. Activity G is on both paths, but it's more expensive than activities D and E, so it's more economical to crash D by 2 weeks at $75 per week for a total of $150 than crash activity E, also by 2 weeks at a cost of $50 per week for a total of $100. Now, we have shaved 2 weeks off each of paths 1 and 2 to end up at 10 weeks for a total cost of $400. Both paths 1 and 2 are still critical, and activity D can no longer be crashed. Activity E can still be crashed by 1 week if we need to. Our last requirement is to crash the project as far as we can go, so we will continue with our next wave. We still must focus on paths 1 and 2 since they are both critical and find activities on both paths that can be crashed or crash activities that are common to both. Notice here that activities C and D are red, and I have now removed D from the paths because it can no longer be crashed. We can see that our options are getting limited. The next least expensive activity is E, but it isn't on both paths, so we have to leave it for now. Activity G, at $250, is the next cheapest and it happens to be common to both paths, so let's crash that one, but its maximum crash is only 2 weeks, for a total cost of $500. This now reduces our completing time on paths 1 and 2 to 8 weeks, and G can no longer be crashed, so we have to eliminate it in the next wave. For wave 4, there are no activities common to the critical paths, so we have no choice but to crash different activities on each path. Activity E is available to crash by 1 week at a cost of $50, and activity A can also be crashed by 1 week at a cost of $600. Thus, we have now gotten our project down to 7 weeks, with paths 1 and 2 still critical. Now, activities A and E have been removed from the paths because they can't be crashed anymore. We are now left with activities B and F. B is the next cheapest to crash, and if we did we would reduce the time on path 2 by 1 week, but path 1 is still critical, so we would be wasting our money. The project will still take 7 weeks to complete. The same can be said for activity F. Thus, the maximum time this project can be crashed to is 7 weeks, at a total cost of $650.
Okay, that takes us almost out of time. Let's hear a comment or two from any of you, but Mitch specifically, the concept of crashing.
All right, so from what I gathered, you're reducing the time through a cost, and the most efficient way to get there through waves. So looking at the critical path and, trying to reduce that, or crash it with cost and trying to get that time down in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah. It's kind of what we instinctively do, right? It's what we do. What'd you get?
From what I got out of it is, it's a way to determine the, like, if you have multiple critical paths, like if you come out with 2 or 3, you can break it down to determine what is truly the most critical, or what would be estimated to be the most critical to determine that one. Am I on track here?
You're on track, yeah, because there are some that can't be crashed, right? I mean, you get to the point where you've wrung it out. Now, from a lean perspective, continuous improvement says theoretically we can always get better. And by always getting better means we can always get an additional crash. But we're picking low-hanging fruit on this thing. We're looking at the obvious and seeing what we can do. And moving the project from 14 to 12 to down to 7 weeks, that makes you look good as a project manager, if you're able to do that. But now we've become more and more critical that everything has to go as planned, right? We got less margin for error all the way through. And it's one of the things that we haven't talked about that we will talk about is how do we get these estimates more accurate? Because we'll find out that, if I'm working at Wilding, Andrew will figure out that I can bag my numbers. I know I can get this, and so I give him a number that is a no-brainer, that I know I can hit this. And so he'll start to discount my numbers. And he knows that somebody else overestimates what they can get done. And so he learns to discount their numbers in the opposite direction. So as we manage the project, we know who underestimates and we know who overestimates, and we start to dial it in a little bit tighter with that. Right now, we're looking at face value of the projections. We're not arguing with when they say this thing takes 2 weeks. We're not going, oh, come on, man. We're accepting that, and then we're managing against that. This gives us some control of a project, and it makes it look like we really got our thumb on it, right? Because we know exactly where we've got slack, where we don't have slack, And if we're gonna have something that's gotta budge, we know how to figure the cost to make it budge at the least incremental cost, right? That's what we wanna do. I think we need to do a little bit more about crashing, but I think that was that was an overview of what it was about. I don't think we need to do more about how to do the network diagramming itself. You've seen it now enough times and you got it, right? So you've got a homework assignment to do your Christmas party plan. I don't know, we counted off in teams of 3 and then we didn't do anything from that. So the teams of 3, was everybody here Tuesday? Eli was not. So since that was a fail, meaning I didn't get the assignment done right, that's on me. Let's recount, and as you leave, we're out of time, as you leave, just decide how you're gonna have your plan, how your team is gonna come up, because each team needs to come up with your Christmas party thing. And you know what? That's a lame way of doing it. We'll start class on Tuesday with that assignment. You'll meet the first few minutes of class and get that figured out. So let's have a good weekend, and I'm gonna get healthy, and we'll see you guys on Tuesday. Thanks.